Okay, I think that's 4 o'clock, so I think we will just get started. There are people still joining, but that's okay. They can just join as we go along. So welcome again to session 6 in the programme, and tonight we are focusing on teaching time. So this afternoon session is being recorded, and the link to the recording will be added to the Padlet as soon as it's available. Can I ask that during the presentation you keep your camera off and your mics on mute? This just helps with the connection quality. So we are using PowerPoint Live, and if you've attended the previous sessions, you'll already be familiar with the accessibility features highlighted on the screen. So just briefly, you can navigate to the slides using arrows, and you can use the drop-down menu to use the full screen facility and to turn on live captions if you find it helpful. So during the session, you can make comments in the chat or in the Padlet link, which will come up just a bit later. You can ask questions in the chat function as well, and you can use the hands up function if you'd like to be invited in to speak. So if you're having problems with either sound access to the chat or viewing the slides, in the first instance, we would recommend just leaving and rejoining. This usually fixes the problem. And finally, you'll see a take control button at the top of the screen. We'd ask that you please don't click on that, as this will likely cause everyone to lose access to the presentation. So for those that have attended previous sessions, in session 1 we shared our reasons for offering this programme, and you can see those displayed on the screen there. So just a reminder today that this really is a safe space for us to explore effective approaches to learning, teaching and assessment within numeracy and mathematics. And we hope that this gives you a chance to reflect on and to strengthen your own practice. So just a reminder of us. So I'm Lynette Brotherwood, at the top of the screen there, based in the Southwest, and Iona and Stephen are also joining me this afternoon. The joining codes for the local teams are there on the screen, and you'll be able to access them on the slides from the Padlet later on if you haven't already joined. The dates for the regional drop-ins will be displayed at the end of the presentation this afternoon. So again, a reminder, I already mentioned that you can make a comment or ask a question through the meeting chat tonight. But of course we'll lose that after tonight's webinar. So we made up a Padlet which has been ongoing throughout the series of events, and you can still use that to post a question. I had a quick check before we came on this afternoon, and I don't think there's been anything added between the previous session and this one, but remember you can pose anything on that you would like us to return to in one of our later sessions. Okay. So this afternoon we're going to look at teaching time from 2nd through to 4th level. We'll also touch on links with senior phase towards the end. We know that some learners still struggle with time even at secondary school, so we'll include some ideas for teaching the basics of telling the time. And if you're particularly interested in concepts around early or first, then we can direct you to the session that's been delivered by our colleagues this afternoon. So just a quick little starter to get you thinking. Take a read, and please note in the chat some of the common errors and misconceptions held by learners in the secondary classroom. I'm just going to give you a few minutes to have a think about that. I'm not seeing anything in the chat yet. Stephen, Iona, are you seen it? Oh, yep, they're popping up now. "24-hour clock. 1 hour and 45 minutes is 1.45. Yep, absolutely. I think there'll be a few there, but also that idea of, you know, midnight being the start to the day. Stairs using. Yeah, all things that we have probably all come across at some point. We can see that somebody's typing away in the chat there. So I don't want to move on until that's popped up. But I'm going to be handing over to Stephen for the next set of slides, where hopefully we'll begin to think a little bit about how we can address some of these issues.
Thanks very much, Nanette. Can I check, can you hear me? I think I'm having difficulties.
No, you're loud and clear, Stephen.
Brilliant, thanks very much. And someone just made the point to chat there about having the analogue clock and learners struggling to read it. And we'll look into that as we go through the session. Thanks, Nanette. I don't know if you've
move on.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks everyone. I'm glad to be here with you. I hope you can hear me okay. So you might find, even though we're secondary practitioners, you might find that you're still working with some learners and telling the time at every stage in high school. Here we're looking at quarter past and quarter to as an example, and you'll see that a sound understanding of fractions is really important. If your learners aren't confident with quarters, then it's a good idea to go back and reinforce this concept. In the middle there you'll see an unrolled timeline with quarter-hour intervals, and that can help learners get to grips with progression in time, and it may help them develop their understanding of quarter past, half past and quarter to as points through time through each hour. Multiple representations can be used, and bar models can help reinforce the idea of a quarter of an hour being 15 minutes. And for some learners, an activity like folding paper plates into quarters can be a helpful way to link fractions to a clock face. Now these days, as you can see in the bottom right, learners may be more familiar with digital clocks rather than clock faces. And there are lots of games and matching activities around that you can employ to help learners practice equivalence. We've included links to various resources at the end of the presentation, and you'll find them in the PDF that you'll download afterwards. Thanks, Nanette. When recapping 24-hour clock with learners, there are many representations of visual tools that they can use to help them develop their understanding. For example, showing how a timeline can be made from a circle to show that repetition and continuation through the 24 hours and between day to day. Again, matching games can help, but placing this work in everyday context is especially important. For example, finding examples of 24-hour times in their local transport timetables or any TV guides that they use at home. Thanks, Nanette. When we're considering notation, try to avoid using that single dot between hours and minutes so that we don't cause confusion with the decimal point. Use a colon instead, whether it's 12 or 24-hour notation, although as you'll have seen in your own practice, the 24-hour clock, sometimes there's no colon appears at all, and it's just the hours and minutes. The screenshots that we've taken here are from a website called Top Marks, and you'll find an interactive clock there activity that you can help to use teach time. It's really important that you ensure your learners understand the difference between telling the time and time durations. For example, 1:25 p.m. is 25 minutes past 1 o'clock in the afternoon, whereas 1 hour 25 minutes is a length of time. The confusion is, of course, that they're not completely independent, as 1:25 p.m. is the time when it's an hour and 25 minutes away from midday. 1:25 should never be used to denote a duration of time. It should be written with reference to hours and minutes. Be careful when, as you can see, the waters are truly muddied when you introduce decimal fractions of hours. Think about how often you might have seen learners interpret 1.25 hours as 1 hour and 25 minutes. So lots of practice is required in that to make sure that learners have a sound understanding of decimal time and fractions of an hour. Thanks, Lynette. You'll see different ways there that we can help support learners to develop a range of visual and mental strategies on proportional reasoning and fractions that can be reinforced and practiced in the concept of time. Bar models, number lines and other visual representations can be useful when working out how to convert between measurements of time in different units, and not only can they help children find an answer, they can actually help them explain their reasoning to yourself as well. There are 3 different ways learners might be able to visualise and express equivalent forms of the length of time, 1 hour and 45 minutes. You'll see there that there's a bar model that's been used to give a representation of fractional time, minutes and hours and minutes, a fraction diagram where we're using circles, and a number line. To aid mental calculations, your learners might use a blank clock face to count round, or call on the range of mental strategies that they've developed. The recall of multiples of in this case 15, and their understand of count non-infractions are essential prerequisites for this. And so we would advise that lots of practice on that is required before you look at time problems. This animated slide will show how number lines are really helpful in working out time intervals. It's important that as soon as they come in from first year that you practice number bonds to 60. For example, you could use flashcards with a series of whole numbers less than 60 and have your learners work out mentally the other quantity to make up to 60. This is a vital skill when bridging to the next hour and working out time intervals. When calculating time intervals, particularly more challenging ones, encourage your learners to employ a range of strategies that they've learned for subtracting numbers. Rather than asking them to do lots of calculations, which might be carried out the same way, you could ask them in a variety of ways to calculate out a small number of time intervals. An empty number line that we've mentioned before is always really helpful here. The first one shows that bridging to the nearest hour, which is a common strategy that you'll see learners use. The next is counting whole hours first, a bit like jumping on but with whole numbers. And then finally counting past the time, a whole number of hours, and then backwards is another strategy, which you'll see works quite well for this example. A bit like what we would call the overjump strategy in the number processes. There are of course different strategies that your learners will bring, which are more or less efficient depending on the time involved. Using number sense and common sense to choose the most efficient strategy in class is a skill that you can help your learners develop through this sort of explanation. Thank you so much. I'm over to Iona, I think.
Thanks, Stephen. Can we just do a quick sound check again? Is that okay?
Yes, loud and clear, Iona.
Thanks, Lynette. So Stephen mentioned earlier that in order to help learners practice their skills, being able to place it into everyday context can be really helpful. And the next few slides are just some different ideas of some resources, both online and otherwise, that might be on paper that you have that can be used to really help learners practice their skills, but also in a way that's going to kind of make sense to them. So TV listings is a good start. It's usually a good way to help calculate easier time intervals because programs are so often in half-hour slots or hour-long slots. It's interesting to note the difference between what traditional TV listings look like in newspapers, which only have the starting times of each programme. But then if you look at online listings, they tend to look a bit like the one you can see on the screen, which is a horizontal timeline approach. And these are a really nice data-rich visual from which lots of questions can naturally rise. You could start with quite specific questions, so some directed questions that kind of help them see, help you see what their understanding's like of specific skills. So, for example, you might just simply ask, what time does 24 hours in A&E start? Or you might ask, how long is the Paul O'Grady programme? Or what programme is on Channel 5 at 9:45, and then how long does it have left? Those kind of mixture of questions that you could ask your learners, or you could get the learners to make up and ask each other as well. But you can also make it a little bit more goal-free. You can go the whole hog and give them the television listing and then say, do you know, what do you notice? What can you work out? Tell me anything you can about any of the programs on there, and really see where your learners are at. That sort of goal-free approach can be really helpful to help you just assess where learners are and allow them to be a little bit creative in what they can work out. Thanks, Annette. So this example is from the Caledonia Brain website, and the CalMac timetables are just great. It's a real life context that may be familiar with some learners if you're in a particular part of the world, if you're in one of the islands, or in a coastal region, but it might be really quite unfamiliar for learners, particularly if you're in in the middle of the country geographically. So you could show them one of these timetables, and again, you could just be goal-free and say, you know, what do you notice? What do you wonder? What can you work out? You can make it goal-free. Or again, you could be thinking about some directed questions. For example, what time does the second ferry leave Sconser? How long does it take to get to RAASAY? What time does the last ferry leave RAASAY to come back? You can maybe take it a step further out and say, what direction is the ferry travelling at 3:15 in the afternoon? And again, learners could make up their own questions here. One of the benefits of the CalMac ferries timetables is they're not quite so complicated as maybe bus timetables and train timetables are, because there's just fewer of them in a day. So it's maybe just a bit easier and a bit less daunting for learners to look at, whilst being absolutely real life and not a made-up resource. There's also quite a nice use of small print in these as well, where you can use a bit of information handling and problem solving skills. So they might be able to just think critically about, why do these ferries, why are there particular ferries that run on Fridays during school terms? So we might be able to find out a little bit about what it is like to be a school student living on an island. There might be a bit of time management you could build in. So what time to turn up for a ferry, looking at the small print to see, is there a recommended time for being there to make sure you're in time for the ferry. You could also build in a little bit of money and measure practice, so you could ask them to work out how much it would cost for a return journey for a motorhome and a driver and 3 children, for example. So trying to make some sort of richer questions, building in their timetable skills, plus a little bit of extra problem solving on the side. So that these CalMac resources are great for that. Moving on with this, we've now got the idea about how could we use some of the digital route planning tools that are out there, and learners, depending on what they do, where they live, they might have more or less experience of using these kind of route planners. If your learners live in a city, they might be very used to using bus planners, those kind of things. But it's nice to find ones that are a bit less familiar with, so that they can sort of build up these life skills. So planning a journey nowadays, really, it can be made so much easier with these travel apps. But as I say, it's really good to give the learners the opportunity to explore planning routes in this way. So it's developing their digital life skills as well along the way. There's lots of information on these sites to explore, to discuss and to explain. This particular site is the ScotRail site, and what's good is there's no login needed. So what they can do is they can go straight onto the on the browser. They can explore right up until the payment screen and plan journeys, looking at different costs of journeys, looking at different times of journeys, looking at how long the journeys take, the number of changes, all those kinds of things, and the different ticket types, that sort of thing. So it might be worth it if you've got access to digital devices in your classroom or a computer room. You could ask your learners to have a wee explore of that site. There's also the websites of some of the bigger bus companies like Stagecoach, and they can give learners access to quite traditional timetables. So that traditional timetable there is the kind of timetable that in my experience learners find quite challenging to look at, but maybe if they've looked at a simpler version such as the CalMac one before, they might be in a better position to do that. Maybe learners could also use the site to compare times and costs of journeys using different modes of public transport as well. So they might be able to compare a journey on the train, compare a journey on the bus, think about the times, think about the costs, and compare which one that they think is best. It's always lovely to give them questions that there isn't a fixed right or wrong answer to, that they can basically put together an argument as to which they think is better based on the information that they've got. Thanks, Nanette. And this website here, which is the Travel Line website, if you do want to ask learners to compare routes and modes of transport, Travel Line's a good one because they can just pop in their starting point and their finishing point, but they can choose which modes of transport they want to include. There's also the option to use tools such as Google Maps. So they can use the directions option on Google Maps. So if it's on a browser, the search Google Maps kind of looks like that, and it's that blue arrow there that's the directions option. So again, they could compare routes and journeys like that to maybe looking at how long it would take to drive a journey, how long it would take on public transport. And again, they can choose their options as to whether they want to include bus, train, both on those as well. So lots of opportunities there to bring together bits of knowledge and add in a few digital skills, digital life skills as well. Part of what we need to be able to do when we're working with time, as well as thinking about how we can manage our time. And I'm sure there's lots of us who use digital calendars to schedule our days and our events. It's nice to give learners an opportunity to do that. Now, just simply on Glow, we've got the G Suite and Teams options available, and both of those have digital calendars embedded into them. So maybe worth discussing with your learners the benefits and the drawbacks of digital calendars as opposed to maybe written diaries or planners, and just ask learners, what do they use? Do they use their digital calendars maybe on their phones, or do they rely on pen and paper, or do they rely on somebody else to tell them where they need to be and when, which might well be the case. But you might also want to show examples of how you use, if you use these digital tools. So you might have a day mapped out on that, and you can show them how you yourself use them. So we could share a real or created day from an online diary, and then we could also have questions that are kind of around that. But it's also maybe an opportunity to involve maybe non-teaching staff, maybe parents, maybe employers, partners, to speak to classes, or maybe to make videos about how they manage their time, and maybe any digital tools that they use that help them work to deadlines, to plan ahead within their jobs as well. A nice wee opportunity to just build in skills for life and work there, and to hear a story from somebody out with the class, out with the sphere of your classroom. Teachers obviously have a lot to contribute as regards working to deadlines. It's obviously something that we do a lot, but it'd be nice to just hear a wider range of views on that, and hear from the learners themselves about how they manage their time. And it's such a vital skill for learners as they move through the school and out into the workplace. While we're talking about digital tools, there's an awful lot of digital tools to do with phones that are to do with time that are actually inbuilt into mobile phones as well. And they have multiple timing devices. Now, these screenshots here are from my old Sony Xperia, which I used to have. And I know I've got a Huawei phone and the similar tools are on that. So we've got the different tools here. We've got a clock with an alarm clock. Again, great for managing the time, and do the learners set an alarm to get up, or again, do they rely on somebody else to get them up in the morning? But what's also important is that a lot of these devices have both a stopwatch and a timer. Do our learners understand the difference between those two measuring devices, and would they choose the appropriate one to use? So a stopwatch, you would start and stop at the end of an unknown time, so you're not sure how long it's going to take. You use a stopwatch to start it and then measure how long a particular task takes. You might be doing activities that are linked to PE and involving those using stopwatches. Learners might be quite used to using stopwatches. And do they also understand the difference between that and a timer, where a timer is set to a specific time and kind of counts down and sets an alarm? So could learners use that, choose when to use which, and could they explain why, explain their decision in the same way as they would choose to use a ruler or a tape measure when they're measuring distance? Can they use the different options? There's also a world clock on Sony Xperia and on my Huawei's as well, so you're able to add some times in different parts of the world, so that may be a nice thing to bring in if you are starting to look at time zones as well. So what I'm going to ask you to do, just briefly, we're going to have a break after this, just a quick short break in after this slide. So what I would like you to do is, if you've got your phone handy, can you just dig it out and see if on your phone, do you have those tools as well? Do you have a world clock? Do you have a stopwatch? Do you have a timer? And you've probably got an alarm clock. The question is, do you have stopwatch and timer, and do you have a world clock? Because they are quite handy for learners if they're doing that. And while you're also having a wee break, there's a wee screen break, there is another little task for you to do, which is from a great website, Which One Doesn't Belong? And we've got 4 different images here, and you could make an argument for all 4 of them as to under what circumstances could each of those 4 be the odd one out, the one that doesn't belong. So while that's on the screen, we're just going to take a quick 5-minute break just to get up, stretch, grab a cuppa if you need to. A couple of things to do during the break as well if you'd like to. Just use your device to see what timing devices you've got on your phone, and also to have a wee go at this Which One Doesn't Belong if you would like to. So that's 4:28, 4:29. We'll come back in 5 minutes time, so just before 25 to 5. Just check if there's any questions. If you've got any questions as well, feel free to pop them in the chat. So we're going to just take a quick break for 5 minutes, and we'll see you very shortly.
Just a few minutes to stretch your legs, take a breath, look away from the screen. Quite a few comments appearing in the chat there, suggestions for the solution to the task. Anybody, anything else that they'd like to add, then please feel free to put it in the chat, or if anybody has any comments or any thoughts about the task, then put your hand up and we can invite you in to speak. I think what I like about this type of task in particular is that everybody should be able to see something. Everybody should be able to pick out a reason for one of them being the odd one out. You know, it could be either, you know, the one in the bottom right is the only one that's between 4 and 5, the rest are all between 1 and 2, but then it might also just be something just as simple as the one that somebody gave about there being no numbers on the one on the left. So it should allow all your learners to be able to access and feel part of this task. Okay, we'll move on. So I'm going to look a little bit now about at speed, distance, time calculations. So speed is simply just a proportional relationship between a distance covered and a time taken to do so. And it's likely that it will be familiar to your learners in the form of speed limits and travelling in cars and other everyday contexts. However, it is important to introduce carefully the idea of rates in that wider sense. So in the activities you can see in the screen here, we could measure the pace in cubes per minute, smiley faces per minute, or the others that are described in the activities. And so learners can then compare the results to figure out who has built or sorted or drawn slowest or fastest. There's also scope here to link to some science experiments. So for example, you could explore the flow rates through different funnels. Learners can then apply the proportional reason to determine the rate. So for example, if I stacked 14 cubes in 10 seconds, how many would I expect to stack in a minute? So bar models can be used to help to illustrate and perform that type of calculation. They can then move on to written calculations, and often a table style of layout can be really helpful. So in any case, the rate of stacking is measured in cubes per minute, but this could then be scaled up to work out cubes per hour. So we might need to introduce, or we might decide to introduce speed in terms of meters per second by timing learners running a fixed distance and then calculating their speeds. And although measurement in miles is not strictly within the E's and O's, it is the most common measurement of speed around us. That's what we see on distances in roads, and if we're looking in cars, then the speed is recorded in miles per hour. So it's important, therefore, that there's an approximate size of a mile is understood by our learners. And it's also, an awareness of where speed limits of 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 miles per hour, etc. might apply. It's also worth just discussing with learners some simple facts, like the fact that 60 miles per hour means a mile a minute. And these kind of discussions are sometimes we rush on to start to look at working with formulas, and we don't take that time to have those kind of really important discussions. There can just be a real temptation to introduce a formula approach to linking speed distance time. But there is a risk that this results in the topic being viewed as something entirely separate, a topic in its own right, as opposed to a simple extension of proportional relationships. It's often viewed as a trio of formula that need to be remembered. But there is another way to introduce this, so that a more intuitive approach can be taken. So look at the question on the screen and what we're thinking. I've got 2.5 lots of 14 miles, as is 14 miles in each hour. So to calculate the distance, we need to multiply the speed and the time. So in this one, how long would it take a car travelling at an average speed of 50 miles per hour to travel 175 miles? Again, what are we thinking? We've got our 175 miles. How many 50s would it take to make up our 175? So to calculate the time, we're dividing the distance by the number of miles in each hour, or the speed. And again, there's that proportional relationship. So in this case, the time taken to travel 175 miles is 3.5 hours. Again, what do we think here? So the train's travelling at 260 kilometres in 4 hours. And what's its average speed? So the 260 kilometres is shared by 4. The distance is divided by the time. So really what we're talking about is making good use of multiple representations and really encouraging learners to use what they already know rather than introducing speed, distance, time as something completely new and starting from the point of learning a formula. It can be really helpful in dealing with time intervals that are shorter than 1 to continue to build on learners' pre-existing understanding of those proportional reasoning questions that we've already looked at, rather than relying on decimal fractions of hours and using the formula. So in this example, you can see the train travelled 90 kilometres in 45 minutes, but we want to know what its average speed was. So we want to know how far it would travel in an hour. So first of all, we can think about splitting our 90 kilometres into 15-minute sections. We know that we have an extra 15 minutes to add on. So how many kilometres does it travel in the full hour? And that gives us our average speed, 120 kilometres. And that's a much more intuitive approach than initially thinking about multiplying by 4/3. In the interest of efficiency, the use of the formula is likely to be the end goal, but it would be beneficial to discuss how this is taught with some colleagues, particularly your physics and science colleagues, so that the approaches taken within your establishment complement one another. Another thing to think about is, for example, the language that's used across the maths department as opposed to within the science department. So you might consider using velocity rather than speed. And this understanding of the proportional relationships can really help underpin teaching and learning of similar relationships within the physics and chemistry curriculum, rather than that dependency on learning a variety of triangles. Sian, that's an interesting comment. Hopefully we'll have some time for discussion at the end, so that might be something that's worth exploring a bit further. So here's just a nice little task that we came across on the Don Stewart website, which just really encourages learners to think about units and to explore speed and what it actually means. So if you follow the link, that will take you to that, and you can have a look at that when you access the slides after the presentation. And finally, for me, just back to some digital tools again, and Iona mentioned Google Maps earlier, but Google Maps is also an excellent tool for route planning and combining a bit of map reading with planning journeys. So as mentioned before, these could be long. So for example, driving from Dunfermline to Hull, but they could also just be short journeys, walking from school or from home to a local landmark. Learners could estimate their journey times. They could then check them on maps. They could compare different routes, and they could discuss the pros and cons. They could create their own directions, and they could estimate the times for each leg of the journey. If you click on the details option, then this would help them to check their estimates. Okay, I'm going to hand back to Steve now, who's going to take us through the next part of the presentation.
Hi, Nanette, you there?
I am. I can hear you.
Having some day. Thanks very much, Nanette. If you just move on for me. That's great. Thank you. Hi everyone, so looking at time zones and time zone problems, you'll see this is a question from the National 5 Apps specimen paper. The animation will show a double number line, which we think is a lovely way to visually represent those different time zones. The question you'll see there is that he's got a flight of 6 hours 30 minutes and all you're doing is calculating a local time, so you're asking the learner to take into account that there is a difference in the time zone. But they could do that, doing different calculations, counting on and then taking the time zone back. But if you look there, if they start with that double number line approach, then they're really carrying out one calculation. Thanks very much, Nanette. Time.is is a lovely site that's got digital tools that you can try different activities with your learners, such as time zones or the characteristics of different times of the day or seasons in the year. And you can see some examples there of how you might use it. It's a great site. We were looking at it before coming on, and it might be useful for cross-curricular projects and thinking about maybe you could plan with colleagues from geography or business studies and thinking about all the different time tools that are worth exploring on there. Got a link to this for you. Thank you, Annette. Next, graphing stories. So beyond learning how to tell the time, as I was speaking about earlier, looking at timetables, distance, speed time, learners should be given the opportunity to interpret the story told by line graphs, such as this example from the Time PLR that we published. This could be done by giving examples of graphs and asking your learners to choose which graph best fits a given scenario and explain why they think this is the case. You can do this with your learners as a whole class activity, or it could be something that they explore in pairs or in small groups. Continuing with graphing stories, you can see that we can use them as goal-free problems. We've got this example here from the Don Stewart website again, and it's basically simply asking your learners to tell you the story. What could this graph represent? What kind of realistic journey could you make here out of the information that's given? Lots of resources here. It's important to give your learners the opportunity to combine solving distance, speed, time problems and other areas of the maths curriculum, and in context and other areas of the curriculum like I was talking about earlier. Interpreting information displayed in a graph is a good way to do this. I've given you a link here for some interactive questions in the Transum website. Distance, speed, time circles is one of the Scotland Learns tasks that were put together during lockdown by the ES team. And then you'll see other tasks there from Craig Barton's Same Surface, Different Deep collection. They consist of a series of problems with similar surface structure but different deep depth. They're a good way to use as a tool to promote your learners' more careful reading of questions and the correct strategy selection from their toolbox when solving problems. We've got a number of pedagogy mini guides on our professional learner community, and if you're interested in finding out more, we've added a link, as you'll see there, to the SSDD guide on our website. Now, we spoke about SSDD before, and there's there for lots and lots of different topics, and there's one there for time as well. Thanks, Nanette. Linking speed, distance and time, and Nanette spoke about a proportional approach as well as using the formula. It's really important that your learners at third and fourth level, and even get into the senior phase, that those kind of basic second level knowledge and skills are kept fresh in their head. They're important. We can, however, increase the level of demand that we're asking our learners by offering problems in a kind of more unfamiliar context and problems that bring together skills from different areas of the curriculum. And that's what you can use PISA tests for. These problems you can see from the past tests are a nice source of problems that add a bit more real life and a bit less textbook. I'll give you a wee minute to read some of them. And again, if you think about digital tools, you're not asking the learners to use time.is for any, to work anything out other than tell the story of what they're seeing here. So it's helping with citizenship as well, perhaps, and giving them an awareness of time around the world and learning more about society. Thanks, Annette. A history of time, we've put together some links and videos here. The history of the measurement of time is fascinating, and it's worth exploring with your younger learners, and it's perhaps a project they could undertake as part of their time in class or at home. The fact that from an exacting kind of physicsy point of view, time is really difficult to define means that it's really an interesting topic to come back to at different stages to explore as the learners are with you. You'll see here that again that we've included some websites for you to use. Thank you. There's some other resources here we'd like to spotlight. We've not mentioned these before. As part of the National e-learning offer and eSchool, there are some learning spaces that your learners might find useful. The links that you can see are given to the main pages for maths and application of maths. But from these pages, they can navigate to any individual level, such as higher, and actually onto any other subject as well. So this is something that might be worth sharing in school. These pages in the National e-learning offer include links to West OS recorded lessons, the relevant BBC bite-sized pages, digital notes, and other relevant web pages. The videos themselves need a Glow login, but the pages don't, and nor do most of the other resources. We've added a link to the Padlet on this one. If you want the next site, next page. The Padlet that we would make available, there's actually links to those learning spaces and the thing links on the Padlet now. It's just to remind you as well, as Nanette said at the beginning, there's a link to the car park for questions and comments that you might want to make or ask each other, and links to the videos and slides for previous sessions, as well as us putting up the PDFs and the regional spaces. And if you move on to the next one for now, I'm going to say that that's us, but I think we're going to maybe take some time to discuss some of the points that were made at the beginning, if we've got time, which we do. But we'll just ask you maybe to take a minute to reflect on what you might want to take away into the discussion that hopefully some of you can stay for. And as always, there's a link there to sign up to the next session, which is in data and analysis in March. And as Nanette was saying, the regional spaces are there for you. You can use the team sites to ask questions of each other, ask us questions, and put up resources that you think would be beneficial to your colleagues.